Lila clutched her stomach, shielding herself as best she could. Through the chaos, she heard the disembodied voice of the shadowy figure that had visited her before. "You defy us, but you cannot win," it growled. "The child is ours. You are ours. Come and take us then," Lila shouted, her voice raw with anger and fear. "You'll have to kill me first." The shadows hesitated, as if considering her challenge. Then, with a deafening roar, they withdrew, leaving the cabin eerily still. Lila knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The forest was testing her, wearing her down for the final confrontation. Lila's relentless study of the symbols began to bear fruit. She discovered a ritual described in Eleanor's journal, an ancient rite that could sever the bond between her bloodline and the forest. But the ritual required 3 key elements: an offering of pure blood, a token of the betrayed, and the courage to face the spirits in their true form. Eleanor appeared to her that night, her spectral form flickering like a dying flame. "You've found it," she said, "but the forest won't let you complete it. They'll do everything in their power to stop you." "What happens if I fail?" Lila asked, dreading the answer. Eleanor's gaze was heavy with sorrow. "Then the curse continues. Your child will be theirs, and the cycle will begin anew." The next morning, Lila woke to find a small, bloodied bundle on the cabin's doorstep. Inside was a lock of golden hair tied with a crimson ribbon, Eleanor's daughter's token. The sight made Lila's stomach churn, but she understood its significance. The forest was taunting her, reminding her of the stakes. As she held the bundle, she felt a surge of determination. She would complete the ritual, no matter the cost. She wouldn't let her child suffer the same fate as Eleanor's. But as she prepared for the first step of the ritual, the whispers returned, more menacing than ever. "You can't save her," they hissed. "She's already ours." Lila ignored them, her resolve unshaken. She didn't know if she would survive what was to come, but she was ready to fight. Lila stood at the threshold of the cabin, holding the bloodied bundle that symbolized Eleanor's daughter. The forest around her was still, as if holding its breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, the gravity of the task ahead weighing heavily on her. The first step of the ritual was clear. She needed to claim the forest's altar, a sacred space where the spirit's power was strongest. But claiming the altar would not be easy. Eleanor had warned her that the forest would not give up its hold willingly. Lila spent hours preparing for the journey. She packed a small bag with the essentials: Eleanor's journal, a knife for protection, and a vial of her own blood, which the ritual required. She wrapped herself in thick layers to ward off the biting cold, but no amount of preparation could shield her from the dread that seeped into her bones. Eleanor's spirit appeared as she fastened her boots. "The altar lies at the heart of the forest," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with both urgency and sorrow. "But the path is treacherous. They will try to break you before you reach it. What do I do when they come for me?" Lila asked. "Hold your ground. Show them you are not afraid." Lila nodded, though fear coiled tight around her throat. She wasn't sure if she could follow Eleanor's advice, but she knew she had no other choice. After what felt like hours, Lila finally reached a clearing. In the center stood the altar, a massive stone slab covered in ancient runes. The air around it hummed with energy, making her skin prickle. But as she stepped closer, figures emerged from the shadows, 3 women, their faces obscured by dark veils. They moved with an unnatural grace, their voices harmonizing in an eerie chant. The child must be given. The cycle must continue. Lila raised her knife, her voice steady despite her fear. "I won't let you take her." The women tilted their heads in unison, as if amused. One of them stepped forward, her veil lifting to reveal hollow eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. "You think you can defy us?" she hissed. "You are nothing but a vessel." "I'm more than that," Lila retorted, her voice rising. "And I'll prove it." The women laughed, their laughter echoing through the clearing. Then, without warning, they attacked. The fight was unlike anything Lila had ever experienced. The women moved like shadows, their forms shifting and twisting as they circled her. She slashed at them with her knife, but they always seemed to be one step ahead, their laughter taunting her. You cannot win, they whispered. Give up, and we may show you mercy. But Lila refused to give in. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth of her unborn child. The child's voice echoed in her mind, soft but resolute. Mama, don't stop. Drawing strength from her child's words, Lila screamed and drove the knife into the ground. The blade struck the altar, sending a shockwave rippling through the clearing. The women shrieked, their forms disintegrating into ash. Panting, Lila collapsed to her knees. The altar was hers, but the battle was far from over. Eleanor appeared beside her, her ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. You've done well, she said, but the first offering must be made now. Lila nodded, her hands trembling as she retrieved the vial of her own blood. She poured it over the altar, the crimson liquid seeping into the runes. The stone began to glow, its surface pulsating with an otherworldly light. The forest reacted violently, the ground shaking as trees bent and cracked. The spirits were angry, their fury palpable. You cannot undo what has been done, they roared. But Lila stood her ground, her resolve unshaken. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. As the glow of the altar faded, Lila felt a searing pain in her abdomen. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as the mark of the spiral burned brightly. It was as if the curse itself was fighting back, trying to reclaim its hold on her. Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. The pain will pass, she said, but the forest won't let you go so easily. The next steps will be even harder. Lila nodded, her jaw set in determination. She had faced the forest's wrath and survived. Now, she was ready to confront whatever came next. The forest was alive with wrath. Trees groaned as if in agony, their bark cracking open to reveal faces twisted in pain. Shadows twisted and danced across the ground, growing taller and more menacing with each step Lila took. Her path to the altar had been grueling, but now, as she ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, she knew she was approaching the final test. Eleanor's spirit lingered nearby, her voice a constant whisper in Lila's ear. They will show you your greatest fears. You must not succumb. The forest shifted around her, the trees melting into darkness. When the world solidified again, Lila found herself standing in her childhood bedroom. It was exactly as she remembered. Peeling wallpaper, a sagging bed with a patchwork quilt, and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets her mother used to tuck under the pillows. But something was off. The room was too still, too quiet. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. Lila, a voice called, soft and familiar. She turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt. Mom? Lila's voice trembled. She hadn't seen her mother in years, not since she'd been kicked out of the house for being pregnant. The sight of her now, unchanged by time, sent a wave of longing crashing over her. Her mother stepped closer, her eyes glassy and devoid of warmth. Why did you leave us? She asked, her voice dripping with accusation. Why did you betray your family? I didn't leave, Lila said, her throat tightening. You threw me out. You didn't give me a choice. You're lying, her mother hissed, her face contorting into something monstrous. You abandoned us, just like you'll abandon your child. Lila stumbled back, her heart pounding. The room began to warp, the walls closing in around her. No, she shouted. That's not true. The vision shattered, the bedroom dissolving into darkness. Lila found herself back in the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest shifted around her, the trees melting into darkness. When the world solidified again, Lila found herself standing in her childhood bedroom. It was exactly as she remembered. Peeling wallpaper, a sagging bed with a patchwork quilt, and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets her mother used to tuck under the pillows. But something was off. The room was too still, too quiet. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. Lila, a voice called, soft and familiar. She turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt. Mom? Lila's voice trembled. She hadn't seen her mother in years, not since she'd been kicked out of the house for being pregnant. The sight of her now, unchanged by time, sent a wave of longing crashing over her. Her mother stepped closer, her eyes glassy and devoid of warmth. "Why did you leave us?" she asked, her voice dripping with accusation. "Why did you betray your family?" "I didn't leave," Lila said, her throat tightening. "You threw me out. You didn't give me a choice." "You're lying," her mother hissed, her face contorting into something monstrous. "You abandoned us, just like you'll abandon your child." Lila stumbled back, her heart pounding. The room began to warp, the walls closing in around her. "No," she shouted. "That's not true." The vision shattered, the bedroom dissolving into darkness. Lila found herself back in the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They spoke in a cacophony of overlapping voices, each one dripping with malice. "You are unworthy. Your child will suffer because of you. Turn back before it's too late." Lila pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing inside her skull. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it," she screamed. "Leave me alone." The forest seemed to hesitate, as if taken aback by her defiance. The voices quieted, replaced by a single, low laugh. "You are stronger than we thought," the voice said. "But strength alone will not save you." The path ahead was shrouded in mist, but Lila pushed forward, determined not to let the forest break her. As she walked, the mist thickened until she could barely see her own hands. Then, out of the fog, a figure emerged, a woman who looked exactly like Lila. Her doppelganger stood motionless, her eyes cold and calculating. "Who are you?" Lila demanded. "I'm you," the figure said, her voice a perfect mimicry. "The real you. The one who isn't afraid to admit the truth." "What truth?" Lila asked, her voice wavering. The doppelganger smiled, a cruel twist of her lips. "That you hate your child. That you wish she'd never been born." Lila's stomach churned. "That's not true, isn't it?" The figure pressed. "Think about everything you've lost because of her. Your family, your freedom, your future. She's a curse. And you know it." "Stop!" Lila shouted, her voice cracking. "You don't know me?" "I am you," the figure said, stepping closer. "And I know you better than anyone." For a moment, doubt crept into Lila's mind. She thought of the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities. But then she thought of her daughter, her laughter, her hugs, the way she lit up the darkest days. "No," Lila said firmly. "You're not me. I love my child more than anything, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." The doppelganger's face twisted in fury. She lunged at Lila, but Lila stood her ground. The figure dissolved into mist, her screams echoing through the forest. The path ended at a massive chasm, its depths hidden by swirling darkness. On the other side, Lila could see a faint glow, the final altar. But there was no bridge, no way to cross. "You must jump," Eleanor's voice whispered. Lila's heart sank. The chasm was impossibly wide, the drop surely fatal. But she had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped to the edge. "If this is what it takes," she murmured, "then so be it." She closed her eyes and leaped. For a moment, she was weightless, suspended in the void. Then, instead of falling, she landed softly on solid ground. When she opened her eyes, she was standing before the final altar. The light from the altar dimmed, leaving Lila kneeling in its glow. The forest was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an eerie stillness. She clutched the knife, its hilt warm in her hand, and stared at the cracked stone of the altar. "It is done," Eleanor's voice whispered, but this time it carried a tone of unease. Lila felt no relief, only a growing sense of dread. The figure of shadow had been banished, but its parting cry lingered in her mind, a wail of despair, anger, and something else she couldn't quite place. As Lila rose to her feet, the forest shifted again. This time, the change was subtle, almost imperceptible. The trees no longer groaned, and the oppressive shadows had receded. But there was something wrong with the air itself. It was thick, buzzing with an unnatural energy. "Eleanor," Lila said, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" "You broke the curse," Eleanor replied, appearing at her side. Her spectral form flickered, weaker than before. But the forest does not let go so easily. It fights to reclaim what it has lost. Lila's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Before Eleanor could answer, the ground beneath them began to quake. Roots burst from the soil, writhing like serpents. They lashed out at Lila, forcing her to dodge and weave as she struggled to keep her footing. "Run!" Eleanor shouted. Lila bolted, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. The forest came alive around her, branches clawing at her clothes and roots snaking toward her feet. She ran blindly, her heart pounding in her chest, until she stumbled into a clearing. The clearing was unlike any part of the forest she had seen before. It was circular, the ground covered in soft moss that glowed faintly in the darkness. At its center stood a single tree, ancient and gnarled, its trunk twisted into a grotesque shape that resembled a human face. Lila approached cautiously, drawn to the tree despite the sense of foreboding it exuded. As she got closer, images began to flicker across its surface, scenes from the past captured in the twisting bark. She saw herself as a child, playing in the yard while her mother watched from the porch. The image shifted, showing her father scolding her for a minor mistake, his face red with anger. Then came the moment she had been dreading. Her teenage self standing in the kitchen, tearfully confessing her pregnancy. Her parents' reactions played out before her, as vivid as the day it had happened. Her mother's face hardened, her father's voice rising in fury. The memory of being cast out into the night came rushing back, and Lila felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The tree did not answer, but the images continued. Now they showed her wandering the streets, her belly growing with each passing day. She saw herself giving birth alone in a cold, dimly lit room, and the first time she held her daughter in her arms. The final image was of her daughter, older now, standing at the edge of the forest. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was calling out for Lila. "Mommy!" The image dissolved, leaving Lila staring at the blank surface of the tree. Her hands trembled as she gripped the knife. The altar was different from the others. It was smaller, less imposing, but its power was undeniable. Standing beside, it was a figure cloaked in shadow, the embodiment of the forest's wrath. "You have defied us at every turn," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "But your defiance ends here." Lila stepped forward, her knife in hand. "I'm not afraid of you." The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You should be." It lunged at her, its shadowy form enveloping her in darkness. Lila fought back with everything she had, slashing at the shadows with her knife. But the figure was relentless, its power overwhelming. As the darkness closed in around her, Lila thought of her daughter. She thought of her laughter, her bright eyes, and her unshakable spirit. Drawing strength from that image, she plunged the knife into the altar. A blinding light erupted, banishing the shadows and sending the figure howling into the void. The light from the altar dimmed, leaving Lila kneeling in its glow. The forest was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an eerie stillness. She clutched the knife, its hilt warm in her hand, and stared at the cracked stone of the altar. "It is done," Eleanor's voice whispered, but this time it carried a tone of unease. Lila felt no relief, only a growing sense of dread. The figure of shadow had been banished, but its parting cry lingered in her mind, a wail of despair, anger, and something else she couldn't quite place. Eleanor appeared beside her again, her form more transparent than ever. "This is the forest's final test," she said. "It wants to see if you are willing to confront the truth." "What truth?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "The curse was not placed on the forest. It was placed on you." Lila froze. "What are you talking about?" "The shadow you fought. It wasn't just a spirit of the forest. It was a manifestation of your pain, your anger, and your fear. The forest amplified it, fed off it, but it came from you. The words hit Lila like a physical blow. She staggered back, her mind racing. "No," she said. "That's not possible. You've carried the curse with you since the day you were cast out," Eleanor said gently. "And it will only be broken if you let go of the darkness inside you." Lila's grip on the knife tightened. "How?" Eleanor pointed to the tree. "You must make a choice. Destroy the tree, and you destroy the forest, but the pain will remain. Or you can leave the tree standing, and the forest will begin to heal. But to do that, you must forgive." "Forgive?" Lila repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Forgive my parents for what they did to me? Forgive this forest for everything it's put me through?" Eleanor nodded. "Forgiveness is the only way to set yourself free." Lila turned back to the tree, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The knife felt heavy in her hand, its blade gleaming in the faint light. She thought of her parents, of the pain they had caused her. She thought of the forest, of the terror and trials it had forced her to endure. And she thought of her daughter, waiting for her on the other side. Anger surged within her, hot and consuming. Destroying the tree would be easy. It would be satisfying. But as she raised the knife, a memory surfaced. Her daughter's laughter, pure and innocent, cutting through the darkness. Lila lowered the knife, tears streaming down her face. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I forgive you all." The tree shuddered, its bark cracking and peeling away. Light burst forth, filling the clearing with a warm, golden glow. The forest sighed, a sound of relief that echoed through the air. The roots receded, the branches stilled, and the oppressive energy dissolved. Lila felt a weight lift from her chest, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Eleanor smiled, her form solidifying for a moment. "You've done it," she said. "The forest will heal now. And so will you." Lila looked down at the knife in her hand. It was no longer a weapon, but a simple tool, a reminder of the journey she had undertaken. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. Eleanor nodded. "Go to your daughter. She needs you." The golden light of the forest lingered as Lila made her way back. The path, once treacherous and dark, was now illuminated by soft, warm hues filtering through the leaves. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the gentle hum of life. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. As she walked, Lila felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had faced her deepest fears, confronted the darkness within her, and found forgiveness where she thought none existed. But the question loomed: what awaited her outside the forest? Lila emerged from the woods and found herself on the edge of the town she had once called home. Her heart raced as she spotted her daughter standing by the road, her small figure silhouetted against the early morning light. "Mommy!" the girl cried, her voice carrying a mix of fear and joy. Lila dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, as her daughter ran into her embrace. The warmth of her little body against Lila's own brought tears to her eyes. "I'm here," Lila whispered, holding her tightly. "I'm here, sweetheart." Her daughter pulled back just enough to look into Lila's eyes. "The shadows are gone," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Lila nodded, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "Yes, they're gone. They won't bother us anymore." As she stood, holding her daughter's hand, Lila noticed the forest behind her. It no longer felt like a place of nightmares, but one of mystery and quiet beauty. The trees seemed to nod in approval, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Walking through the town, Lila couldn't ignore the stares. People paused mid-step, their gazes lingering on her as if they were seeing a ghost. Whispers followed her every step, growing louder and bolder as she approached her parents' house. The house loomed ahead, unchanged and yet somehow smaller than she remembered. Her grip tightened on her daughter's hand as she climbed the porch steps. Memories flooded her mind. The slammed door, the shouting, the cold night air as she was cast out. But she forced herself to focus on the present. She knocked. The door creaked open to reveal her mother. The older woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of years stretching between them. "Lila," her mother finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom," Lila replied, her tone steady. "I need to talk to you. To both of you." Her mother hesitated before stepping aside. Lila entered, her daughter at her side, and found her father sitting in the living room. His expression mirrored her mother's, a mix of disbelief, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite name. Lila didn't sit. Instead, she stood in the center of the room, her daughter clutching her hand. She met her parents' eyes, one after the other, and spoke. "You threw me out," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You turned your back on me when I needed you the most. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Her mother began to cry softly, but her father's face remained stoic. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said, his voice gruff. "We thought you'd learn, that you'd—" "Learn what?" Lila interrupted, her voice rising. "That I wasn't worth your love unless I fit your idea of perfection? I was a scared teenager, Dad. I needed you." Her father looked away, shame flickering across his face. Her mother sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. "I survived," Lila continued, her tone softening. "I found strength I didn't know I had, and I have a beautiful daughter to show for it. But I didn't deserve what you did to me. No one deserves that." The room fell silent. Her parents looked at her, their faces etched with guilt and regret. "I forgive you," Lila said, surprising even herself. "Not because you deserve it, but because I need to move on. For me, and for her." Her mother looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Lila, we're so sorry," she whispered. "We were wrong. So wrong." Her father nodded, his voice breaking as he said, "We can't undo what we did, but we want to make it right. If you'll let us." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Lila and her parents began the slow, painful process of rebuilding their relationship. There were moments of tension and tears, but also laughter and hope. Her daughter quickly became the light of her grandparents' lives, her presence bridging gaps that words alone could not. Lila returned to the forest once, standing at its edge and staring into its depths. She didn't venture inside, but she felt its presence, a quiet, watchful thing. She whispered a thank you and turned away, knowing she would never forget the lessons it had taught her. As the weeks turned into months, Lila found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. The scars of her past remained, but they no longer defined her. She had faced her demons, both literal and figurative, and come out stronger. Her daughter flourished, her laughter filling the house that had once been a place of pain. Together, they created a new life, one built on love, resilience, and the knowledge that even the darkest shadows can be overcome. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of finality as Lila sat on the porch of her parents' house, watching her daughter play in the yard. The past few months had been transformative, filled with tentative reconciliations and rediscovered joys. Yet, a strange unease lingered in the back of her mind, a whisper from the forest that refused to be silenced. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Lila's father opened it to reveal an elderly man dressed in a worn, dark coat. His eyes, sharp and unsettling, scanned the room before settling on Lila. "You're Lila," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "The girl who ventured into the cursed forest." Lila stood, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" The man stepped inside without invitation, his presence filling the room. "My name is Elias. I've been the keeper of the forest's secrets for decades. And you, your story isn't finished." Her parents exchanged nervous glances, but Lila felt a strange pull toward the man. She nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "The forest doesn't simply let people go," Elias said, his tone heavy with warning. "You walked out, yes, but the darkness you left behind has begun to stir." Elias told a tale of the forest's origins, a place once vibrant and alive, corrupted by the anguish and hatred of those who sought refuge within it. Over time, it had become a prison for souls unwilling to let go of their pain. "Your child," Elias said, pointing to Lila's daughter, was marked the moment she entered. The forest claimed a part of her, just as it did you. Lila's blood ran cold. She thought of the nightmares her daughter had experienced, the shadows that seemed to linger in her gaze. "What do you mean, Marked?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling. "She's connected to the forest now," Elias replied. "And if the darkness isn't contained, it will consume her. And you." Elias explained that the only way to sever the connection was to return to the forest and confront its heart, a place where the corruption was strongest. Lila would need to offer something in exchange, something precious and irreplaceable. Lila's parents protested vehemently, begging her not to go. But Lila knew she had no choice. The forest had already taken so much from her. She couldn't let it claim her daughter as well. "I have to do this," she said, her voice resolute. For her daughter clung to her, tears streaming down her face. "Don't go, Mommy. Please don't go." Lila knelt and cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "I'll come back," she promised. "I'll always come back to you." The forest was different this time. It no longer felt like a labyrinth of terror, but a living, breathing entity. Shadows moved with purpose, their whispers louder and more insistent. Lila followed Elias through the twisting paths, her resolve unwavering. At the heart of the forest lay a clearing bathed in an eerie, pale light. In its center stood a gnarled tree, its roots stretching deep into the earth. The air was thick with malevolence, and Lila felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. "This is it," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The source of the corruption." Lila stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. She placed her hands on the tree's rough bark and closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. The pain of being cast out, the terror of surviving alone, the joy of holding her daughter for the first time. She offered it all, every ounce of her soul, as a sacrifice. The tree began to shudder, its branches creaking and groaning as if in agony. A deafening roar filled the clearing, and the shadows surged toward Lila. She braced herself, expecting pain, but instead felt a strange warmth envelop her. The darkness receded, drawn into the tree's roots and disappearing into the earth. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a profound stillness. "You've done it," Elias said, on his voice. "The forest is free." Lila staggered back, exhausted but alive. She looked around, the clearing now bathed in golden light. The forest no longer felt like a place of nightmares but one of peace. When Lila returned home, she was greeted by her daughter's joyful cry and her parents' tearful embrace. The nightmare was over, and the bond between mother and child was stronger than ever. Yet, Lila knew she had left a part of herself in the forest. She felt its absence, a hollow space in her soul where the shadows had once dwelled. But it was a sacrifice she would make 1,000 times over for her daughter's safety. As the days turned into years, the memory of the forest faded, but its lessons remained. Lila learned to cherish every moment, to find strength in vulnerability, and to forgive, not just others, but herself. Decades later, Lila's daughter, now a grown woman, returned to the edge of the forest. She stood beneath its towering trees, feeling their quiet strength. The forest was no longer a place of fear, but a reminder of her mother's love and sacrifice. She whispered a silent thank you before turning away, leaving the past behind and stepping into the future.